In the year 1330, an English farmwife committed a crime. It sat in her kitchen, hidden under a sack of oats. 2 flat stones, one turning against the other. A hand mill, small enough to bury in an hour. She was grinding her own grain to feed her own children, and across most of medieval England, that was illegal. Every sack she harvested belonged by law in one building, the Lord's Mill. And the Lord's Mill meant one man, the miller. Here was the problem. Nobody trusted him. Not the farmwife hiding her stones, not the neighbours watching their sacks come back lighter, not the poets, not the judges, not the priests. For 500 years, nearly everyone in Europe agreed that the man who ground their bread was robbing them blind. He was mocked, sued, cursed, and occasionally beaten in the road. Tonight we follow one sack of grain through the mill door and find out whether they were right. What the law forced into the miller's hands. What he skimmed on the way through. What his neighbours did about it. And the twist waiting at the bottom of the story, because the fear that hung over this man was real, but it was aimed at the wrong target. If you had stopped anyone in that village and asked what the mill was, they would not have described a machine. They would have described a toll gate. It stood between every family and every loaf they would ever eat. It ground every sack. It fed every table. It answered to no customer. Under the custom lawyers called suit of mill, the tenants of a manor were bound to bring their grain to their lord's mill and nowhere else. Not to the next village, where the toll was lighter. Not to a neighbour with a quern, and absolutely not to their own kitchen floor. Grinding at home was not thrift. In the manor court, it was theft, because every handful ground at home was toll the mill never collected. Lords sent men to search houses for hand mills, and when they found them, they smashed them or carried them away. Think about what that does to a village. Grain was not one item in the pantry. Grain was the pantry. The most careful estimates we have suggest the bulk of the calories on a peasant table arrived through bread, pottage and ale, and every one of those started as grain, and all of it passed through a single door. One man stood in that doorway. He decided, when your sack was ground, how fine, how fast, and how much of it never came home. You can measure how completely this man sat at the centre of the medieval world by opening a phone book. Miller is one of the 10 most common surnames in America. Müller is the single most common surname in Germany. Meunier in France, Molinaro in Italy, Molnar in Hungary, Melnik in Ukraine, Milner up in Scotland. Different languages, same man. When Europeans started taking family names from their jobs, an enormous number of families ended up named after his. Almost everyone alive with European ancestors has stood in his queue. Hold on to Scotland, by the way. When this story finally ends, centuries later than you would ever guess, it ends there. And before you file this away as a medieval inconvenience, look at your own loaf. In a $3 supermarket loaf, there is roughly a dime's worth of wheat. The other $2.90 live in the middle, in the milling and baking and hauling you never see. We surrendered the middle of our food chain so long ago that we forgot it exists. A medieval family had not forgotten. Their middle was one building at the end of the lane, and they could hear it grinding. Go stand in that queue for a morning and feel how the resentment starts. You loaded the sack before dawn and carried it, or paid a boy with a donkey to haul it, because the law would not let you grind it at the kitchen table. At the mill there is a line, and the line is not first come, first served. The miller decides whose grain goes on the stones next, which means the men he favours get home by noon, and the men he does not wait until dusk. Inside, the building shakes with a noise most medieval people never heard anywhere else in their lives. Tons of oak and stone turning under one roof, the only industrial machine the Middle Ages would ever show most people. You do not follow your sack in. You wait outside while the one thing standing between your children and a hungry spring disappears into the dark and the dust, into the hands of a man you already suspect. Then you carry home a softer, lighter version of what you brought, and you start doing arithmetic you cannot finish. Now walk your sack inside, because the mechanics of the toll are where the fear begins. The miller did not charge money. He charged grain. Before your wheat touched the stones, he took his cut, the mulcher, scooped out with a wooden measuring dish. Depending on the manner, that cut ran from around 1/13 of the sack to 1/24. On paper, simple. In practice, the mill was a black box. The peasant handed over whole grain and walked home with flour, and no scale on earth could tell him exactly what had happened in between. Flour weighs differently than grain. Some is lost as dust in the air, some clings to the stones, some spills. An honest grind shrank your sack a little, a dishonest grind shrank it a little more, and the two were almost impossible to tell apart. Every step of the process offered a place for a thumb. The toll dish could be deeper than the customary measure. The dish could be heaped when custom said it should be struck level. The miller could toll the sack once at the door and once again at the stones. He could swap clean wheat for a poorer batch and keep the difference. He could let your flour sit and take a quiet second helping before you collected it. No receipts, no inspectors on site, no way to watch the machinery without standing inside it. And then there were the animals. A miller's pigs were proverbially the fattest in the parish, and his geese the plumpest, and everyone was certain they knew why. Sweepings, spillage, and the dust of 100 sacks ended up somewhere, and the somewhere waddled around his yard in plain sight. Whether those pigs were fed honestly or not, they were evidence you could see from the road. A walking, grunting ledger of everything the mill absorbed. The village knew every one of these tricks by heart, which tells you something in itself. You do not develop a folklore this detailed about a crime nobody is committing, and the record medieval people left behind reads like a 500-year indictment. Start with the joke every ploughman seemed to know. What is the boldest thing in the world? A miller's shirt, because every morning it grips a thief by the throat. Proverbs said the same thing with a straighter face. An honest miller, people said, has a golden thumb, and the joke had two edges. One meaning was that his thumb earned gold, forever pressing on the balance and testing the meal. The other meaning was blunter. An honest miller was as rare as a golden thumb because there was no such thing. Then the poets took their turn. When Geoffrey Chaucer built his Canterbury Pilgrims in the 1390s, he made his miller a mountain of a man with a red beard, a wart on his nose, and a sword at his hip, a wrestler who could tear a door off its hinges with his head. And Chaucer says it flatly. He knew how to steal corn and take his toll 3 times over. And yet, the poet adds with a wink, he had a thumb of gold. Chaucer's audience did not need the joke explained. Later in the tales, a second miller appears, cheating a Cambridge college out of its grain while the students watch, certain they cannot be fooled. Cheating scholars was practically the job description. The court rolls back the poetry with paperwork. Manor and borough courts fined millers again and again for taking excessive toll, for false measures, for keeping unauthorised dishes. In some towns, the offence was common enough to have its own routine, the way a modern city tickets parking. Juries of neighbours swore out the accusations year after year, generation after generation. So the case looks closed. The most distrusted man in the village really was a thief, and everyone from the ploughman to the poet caught him at it. Except the closed case has a hole in it, and the hole changes who the villain is. Because it turns out the miller usually did not own the mill. The Lord owned it. A watermill was one of the most expensive things a manor could build. A dam, a channel, a building, gears, and imported millstones, and on many estates it was also one of the most profitable single assets the lord possessed. Lords ran mills the way landlords run property. The miller was a tenant. He leased the mill at a fixed rent, often payable in advance, due in full whether the harvest was fat or failed. The toll rates were not his to set either. Custom and the lord fixed them, written into the manor's records long before the current miller was born. Sit with that arrangement for a moment. The rent was certain. The grain coming through the door was not. In a wet summer, when the harvest rotted in the fields, the sacks arriving at the mill shrank, but the rent did not shrink with them. An honest miller in a bad year could grind every sack in the parish, hand over the rent, and be left with nearly nothing to feed his own family. The arithmetic only balanced one way, and it was not the honest way. That is the real reason the medieval miller was feared, not because milling attracted born thieves, but because the position was built so that only a thief could safely occupy it. The lord collected his rent no matter what, and collected something even more useful alongside it. Every curse in the queue landed on the tenant at the door, and none of it stuck to the man who owned the wheel. The fear, in other words, was part of the machinery, and the anger that went with it had nowhere legal to go, because the law belonged to the same lord who owned the mill. There is one more thing worth saying about that sack of flour, though, before we follow the anger. Everything the miller handed back still had to become bread, and that second half of the story is one you can still do with your own hands, the way those families did it. If you want to bake this history instead of just watching it, that is what the Medieval Bakery Collection is for. The Practical Recipes book walks you through the loaves themselves. The Sourdough Manual is for building and keeping a living leaven of your own, the way these households did, and the Sourcing Guide tells you where to find the right heritage grain. It is all over at the Medieval Way store. By the 1320s, though, the quiet war over grinding was already turning openly bitter. Families kept hiding hand mills, and lords kept hunting them. At the abbey town of St. Albans, confiscated millstones famously ended up paved into the abbot's parlour floor, and when the Great Revolt of 1381 swept through, the townspeople pried them up again like trophies. Notice what people were willing to risk for the right to grind at home. Fines, seizure, court, excommunication in some disputes. A handquern cost almost nothing and ground slowly and badly. People fought for it anyway, for decades, because a bad flour you controlled felt safer than a good flour you had to trust a stranger with. The stranger part of it is that the fear went deeper than money, down into places the court rolls never reached. Listen to the stories medieval and later villagers told about mills after dark. The mill stood apart from the village, down by the water, where the wheel groaned and knocked through the night while every other building slept. Folk tales across Europe made it a haunted place, a spot where the devil came to bargain, where things went in whole and came out changed. And the miller himself was a man apart in a way almost no other villager was. He held no strips in the open fields. He did not bring in the harvest with everyone else, or stand in the same debt to the weather. He was paid in kind, from every family's sack, hands white with flour instead of brown with soil. Often he was not even local, a tradesman who moved from manor to manor wherever a lease opened. In a world where belonging meant ploughing the same dirt as your neighbours, the miller ate from everyone's field and worked in none. People fear the man who profits from them without sweating beside them. Every age finds its own version of him. The Middle Ages built theirs a house by the river and locked the village's bread inside it. That is the deepest layer of the fear, and it has nothing to do with a heavy thumb. The miller was the one man in the village whose family visibly never went hungry. His wage was paid in the one currency that mattered, and it flowed to him in famine years just as surely as in fat ones. When harvests failed, and in the early 1300s they failed catastrophically, a farming family watched its bin empty week by week and did the cruelest math in the medieval world. How many mouths? How many months? How many scoops already gone to the mill? The miller did the same math and always came out fed. His toll was a fraction of every family's grain, which meant a famine had to starve the entire parish before it could reach him. Sooner or later, every winter, a family scraping the bottom of its bin would think of him, warm beside his stones, fed by their toll. Whether he had cheated them or not stopped mattering. Dependence feels like theft to the person who depends. He held your winter in his hands, and no one holds our winter in their hands without frightening us. And the system that manufactured him refused to die. Long after knights and serfdom faded into paper, the forced mill remained. This is where the story keeps the promise it made about Scotland. There, the arrangement was called thirlage, and it bound farmers to their laird's mill with tolls harsher than almost anything England knew. Thirlage outlived the Middle Ages. It outlived the last castles, outlived witch trials, outlived the plague itself. It was still legally binding in 1799 when an Act of Parliament finally let the farmers of Scotland buy their way out, and in a handful of English towns, old soak rights were still being bought out for cash well into the 1800s. Think about the timing. Men were paying to escape a medieval grain monopoly in the same decade steam engines were being bolted into factories. The feared man at the mill door was not a medieval problem. He was a design that worked so well it took the modern world itself to dismantle him. Which brings us back to the farmwife and her buried stones, and to the question we set out with. Was the most feared man in the village guilty? Some millers cheated beyond question. The fines are real, the tricks were real, and a system with no oversight will always find hands willing to use it. But line the evidence up, and the shape of it points past him. The tolls he collected were set by the Lord. The rent that squeezed him was set by the Lord. The law that jailed his customers for grinding at home was the Lord's law, enforced in the Lord's court, for the Lord's profit. Even the searches that dragged handmills out of kitchens were carried out in the Lord's name, and the fines they generated went into the Lord's purse. The miller was not the monopoly. He was its doorman, paid in resentment, positioned precisely so that 5 centuries of fury would exhaust itself on him and never climb the hill to the manor house. There is a name for this arrangement, and it did not die with the Middle Ages. Put a necessary service in one set of hands, remove every alternative, make the accounting invisible, and the man at the counter will be hated whether he is honest or not. The genius of the medieval version was that the hatred itself was profitable. An angry village still had to eat, and every loaf of its anger paid toll on the way to the table. 500 years of customers convinced they were being robbed, and the mills never stood empty a single day. No wonder the lords kept building them. 500 years of jokes gave the miller a golden thumb. The gold never stayed in his hand. It flowed up quietly to the man who owned the wheel, and he was never named in a single joke. The fear found the wrong address, and it was built too. Subscribe to Medieval Way, where forgotten history gets a fair trial. So who deserved the fear, the miller or the lord? Tell me below. Until next time, question the measure.